You're listening to ayahuascapodcast.com.
Psychedelics relax the mind in a certain way, make it more plastic and flexible, that then allow that data to actually update the core beliefs. And so people can change from that place, because I'm imagining like these cables, there's this wire in the brain and a wire in the heart, and they never connect, and psychedelics, clears the path, and they're allowed to connect. And I've heard clients say, for the first time, I actually felt the truth of the things I was trying to believe. I remember I had a client who was struggling with an eating disorder, and under the influence of ketamine, they experienced for the first time an appreciation for their body, right? Where, up until that point, they had hated their body and was trying to starve it and shape it so that it would be acceptable.
And
In this episode of ayahuascapodcast.com, I interview Steve Thayer. Steve Thayer is a clinical psychologist specializing in psychedelic-assisted therapy. He's a co-host of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast and the clinical director of the psychotherapy and training at Numinous. We touch upon topics of the therapeutic potential of ketamine, trauma, mental health, and psychedelics for veterans and first responders, psychedelic-assisted therapy versus traditional therapy, accelerating healing through psychedelic therapy, psychospiritual healing, differences between Western and indigenous approaches to psychedelics, and the importance of self-growth for facilitators. Enjoyed this episode. This episode is sponsored by La Huayra Ayahuasca Retreat. At La Huayra, we combine affordability, accessibility, and authenticity. La Huayra, connect, heal, grow. Guys, I'm looking forward to hosting you. Hi guys, and welcome to Ayahuasca Podcast. As always, with you, the host, Sam Believ. Today, I'm having a conversation with Steve Thayer, PhD. He's a clinical psychologist specializing in psychedelic-assisted therapy, particularly using ketamine. After serving in the U.S. Air Force, he transitioned to working with psychedelics to treat conditions like PTSD and depression. He is the clinical director for psychotherapy and training at Numinous, and he also co-hosts the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you on, Steve. Before we kind of start going deep, tell us a little bit about how did you come, how did your life story bring you into mental health and then specifically psychedelics?
Yeah. Well, as a young boy, I struggled with my own mental health, experienced depressed moods and was pretty anxious. In retrospect, I think I had a little bit of OCD. And so it got me really curious about the human mind, the human condition. Why was it that I was struggling in the ways that I was? Especially because I had a really actually pretty idyllic upbringing. Great parents, great family, great community. And so as I aged and got into, later in high school and into college, I got really interested in philosophy. And then my dad sort of teased me like, you're not going to make any money and to be able to support a family as a philosophy major. And so I thought, well, why don't I get into psychology? That seemed like applied philosophy to me. So you got a bachelor's degree in psychology, had a knack for listening. I was deeply curious about others, and my own struggle had made me fairly compassionate about the struggle of others. So I thought, why don't I take all the things that I'm learning and really apply it and be helpful? So then I got into a clinical psychology PhD program and became a clinical psychologist. And then I joined the military. When I finished my training as a clinical psychologist, the capstone to that training is an internship or kind of like a doctor's residency. And I did mine with the military. And in order to do that, I had to join the military. So I came in as a commissioned officer and was in the military for 4 years. And in the military, I really got an appreciation for the ways in which people suffer, especially in response to combat trauma, but also a little disillusioned by what we could do to help these folks. I mean, we were using the kinds of therapies and treatments that were considered best practices based on the science, and we were being helpful, but I was just dissatisfied with how unhelpful we were also being. So when I got out of the military, I was really looking for what's the next frontier? What's the cutting edge? What's the tip of the spear? And that's when I discovered ketamine. I was fortunate enough, there was a local ketamine clinic where I ended up here in Utah. So I started working with them and had a few ketamine treatments myself because I was struggling with some depressed mood. And the first few treatments were a little underwhelming, to be honest. They were they were particularly effective for me. But then one really was what a lot of people describe as a psychedelic experience. There's a little bit of a debate about whether or not ketamine should be included under that broad umbrella of psychedelic, but consciousness altering and mind manifesting for sure. And that really piqued my curiosity. So started really studying, read Michael Pollan's book like many people, and which got me appraised on the history of psychedelics that I wasn't really familiar with. Long story short, I got to become part of a company called Novamind that was trying to be one of those, bigger companies in the psychedelic medicine space, doing teaching, training for their therapists there on how to do ketamine-assisted therapy specifically, but also started to get involved in clinical trials. Novamind got acquired by the company that I'm now a part of, Numinous, and the mission is threefold. We provide mental health care, full spectrum mental health care, including ketamine-assisted therapy. We teach and train other therapists on how to do psychedelic-assisted therapy through our certification program. We also continue to do psychedelic clinical trials. And, our sites do a lot of clinical trials. I've gotten to do clinical trials on psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. I've had the opportunity to work with LSD for generalized anxiety disorder, ketamine. We've got studies on 5-MeO DMT. We just started a study on an MDMA analog, so a drug similar to MDMA. We got one coming up potentially for NN-DMT. So just lots of really cool opportunities to work with the medicine. And then finally, I'll say I had some other experiences with other psychedelics that were transformative, and just really wanted to find a way to bring those experiences to people who are really struggling as a therapist and do more than I had been able to do for people in the past.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for sharing your story. The question that comes to me is, for example, me, myself, as previously an engineer in offshore oil and gas and now kind of running an ayahuasca retreat, it doesn't seem obvious, the transition from military to now psychedelics. And in my own journey, I kind of observed, synchronicities. And, when it comes to making decisions, there seems to be a push. Have you ever noticed anything, let's say, some form of guidance, like in the way you became who you became?
That's a really insightful question, Sam, because, I grew up in a religious framework. I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often called the Mormons. And as a young person, I was very spiritual, for lack of a better term. Like I was trying to find and follow the messages that I thought were coming from God. And then as a young adult, I left that religion, and that transition was very difficult for me because I felt rudderless. Like I didn't have wind in my sails. I didn't know exactly where to go. And like so many people who go through that transition, there was a period of time where I felt pretty nihilistic and pretty hopeless. But I started to play around with following intuition, right? The God within, the truth in my gut. And instead of outsourcing guidance to some deity who I had to guess what they wanted for me, trying to follow the intuition that I felt. Whereas, generally speaking, I'm a pretty cerebral guy. I try to solve problems and think my way through issues. I was trying to get in touch with what I felt inside. And that feeling was never more potent or clear than when I was using a psychedelic medicine. And the first time I experienced psilocybin, I was like, oh, this is mindfulness, right? This is connection to source, to spirit, to the universe, to God, whatever. And I don't have to understand it completely, right? That the divine is something that you can experience, but maybe never fully comprehend. And that's okay. So finding safety in ambiguity was something I thought I would never find. And psychedelics have helped me approach that safety. So, in a roundabout way, I'm trying to answer your question by saying I felt like by following my gut, I was guided. I just tried to follow my curiosity. And, I growing up, I had never altered my consciousness at all, never consumed alcohol, never consumed coffee or tea, really never taken anything but Tylenol for physical pain. And then the first time I altered my consciousness is with psychedelics. So it was pretty profound, and I feel like I'm kind of thinking in real time. This great question is having me reflect. I think I was guided, and I don't know how else to describe that. I don't pretend to know exactly how it happened, but trying to get familiar with and follow my intuition was part of it for sure.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because it's really hard to explain. But there seems to be this kind of thing where like a lot of people almost like scooped from all kind of walks of life and just kind of their direction is being altered. I don't know. I don't really believe much in it myself. I'm still trying to make sense of it. But yeah, in my own journey, it's just so unpredictable. The way I ended up doing things I ended up doing, and yeah, the inner guidance and also just those synchronicities. You mentioned that you were part of Mormon Church, and it's like what I've been noticing, and we get a lot of people from US, but specifically quite a big representation people from Utah, and there's a lot of that sort of religious trauma, I guess, and just people really seeking that. So I don't know if Utah seems to be very special place, and now also for psychedelics. I don't know if you can say anything about that, but just out of curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think this is true of a lot of so-called high demand religions, but I'll speak from like an LDS or Mormon perspective specifically, that when you're part of that church and you believe in that doctrine, you're sort of all in. And Mormonism has very mystical origin, and so there's a tolerance for the mystical. And when people struggle with their faith, or maybe even leave that faith, it creates a big hole, and they're looking for reconnection to God, to that sense of mysticism, to the idea that there's something bigger, that there's something eternal about us. And so I think I can't pretend to be able to explain it all, but I think there's an appetite for connection and a tolerance, as I said, for the mystical that makes people in Utah, maybe in particular, or people who are struggling with their Mormon faith, sort of ready for a psychedelic experience. So, and because the demographics of belief are changing worldwide, particularly in the U.S., and the Mormon people, Mormon folks are no exception to that as we become more secular as a society, we're looking for ways to connect and find meaning. And the psychedelic experience is a very powerful way to do that for many people. I do have some concerns that people will sort of leave one dogma for another. And I do see that sometimes. Some of my clients are, so-called psychedelic community refugees, where they really got wrapped up in a community that was using psychedelics, maybe being facilitated by somebody who didn't have the right intentions and whose ego was, at the front of the stage instead of being of service. And I've seen people really get hurt. But I've also seen people do a lot of healing.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As a sort of leader of a community myself, and inadvertently so, I am very conscious of that. I think there is a very thin line between, let's say, an ayahuasca retreat or a cult, because people are so suggestible in their open state. So I think you have to be really careful with what you say and how you say it, because I've had some facilitators that were kind of attracting too much attention to themselves, and they can easily make your psychedelic experience be about them. So it's there's definitely a lot of like true spirituality that can come from psychedelics. As in, like, I definitely didn't believe in anything before I ever started working with ayahuasca, and now I kind of I'm pretty sure, there is God, whatever you want to call it. Let's go back to, before you started working with psychedelics and you were working as a therapist in the military. We get lots of first responders, and it's almost unfair, people that know, like, society knows that they're the people that deal with a lot of stress, but at the same time, they're not allowed to, they're not allowed to work with psychedelics. Sometimes they're not even allowed to say that they're struggling mentally, because then it can affect their job. Like, what do you think about that? And now, after working with psychedelics, what do you think? Would it be helpful maybe for first responders or military specifically?
I think it could potentially be helpful. We interviewed a gentleman, Michael Higgs, on our podcast, who, military veteran himself, brings military veterans for, I think it was 5-MeO and Iboga ceremonies. There's plenty of Heroic Hearts Project. There's a lot of communities who are trying to get veterans access to these powerful healing modalities. I remember being in the military and being very frustrated by all the barriers between a service member and help. I was working at a military base where there were a lot of folks who had sort of high security clearances, very sensitive jobs. And so they were under a lot of attention and scrutiny for anything that could potentially jeopardize their ability to do their job. So as a therapist, that meant when they came to see me, I had to write a letter to their commander detailing what might be a disqualifying condition for their job. So they didn't have a lot of privacy. I mean, imagine just going to your random therapist and they're like, yeah, tell me everything about you, but if there's anything concerning, I'm going to write a letter to your boss. Like, hell no, I'm not going to talk to you. So that prevented people from showing up at all, or if they did show up, from being completely honest, which really, as you can imagine, put a damper on the therapeutic process. And so that was active duty, right? But I still, to your point, I still think there is a bit of a stigma on our protectors and helpers being vulnerable and needing help, right? We rely on these folks to protect us and to help us when we're in need. So sometimes it might make us a little uncomfortable, the idea that they need help. I think that is changing though, Sam. I think people are recognizing that first responders, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic and the trauma that we all experienced, but first responders, physicians, nurses certainly experienced, that these people need a special kind of help. So it's tragic to me, and I think more than tragic, it's an injustice, that those people who serve our country and are wounded in that service, psychologically and physically, have to leave our country to get access to medicine that can be potentially really helpful because it's not legal here. And that just makes me mad and sad.
Yeah, that really kind of sucks. For example, we have had people like, obviously I'm not going to name any names, but like head of surgery departments of big hospitals in the US that come over here because they're like at the whim, literally suicidal, and nothing else can help. They cannot complain because then they're going to lose their job. So they come to South America seeking ayahuasca and help. And especially like a lot of doctors that cannot seem to find healing in their own medical system, which hopefully people like you are catering to, because you're gonna, give more options to the therapist to work with. Because a lot of times I think with just therapy alone, when it does not involve any psychedelics, there seems to be the progress is too slow. So maybe you can, as an expert, talk to us a little bit about just therapy versus psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Mm. Yeah, I should say that therapy is helpful. Like, it's helpful for a lot of people. Regular old therapy, right? And by that I mean not medicine-assisted. So it's not that the tools we have are completely ineffective. Like I was saying earlier, I'm just not satisfied. And most of the people who have sought mental health care, well, a lot of the people, I should say, would likely agree, especially for these conditions that are so-called treatment resistant, right? Like chronic PTSD or certain forms of depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, like these things that are so disruptive and that we don't have good data to suggest that our treatments are very effective or as effective as they could be. So, most of the work that I do is still not medicine-assisted therapy, part of that just being because legally the only medicine I have access to in my clinic is ketamine. But so regular therapy can still be very helpful. But one of the things I'm passionate about with respect to psychedelic-assisted therapy, and it's why I pivoted my career to psychedelic therapy research and application, is how how psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy can accelerate the therapeutic process, or I should say, grant access to healing to people who have tried all the things and haven't been able to heal. Why that happens is an empirical question, maybe even a psychospiritual question that we're still investigating. We have some ideas, and you've interviewed some people on this podcast who have been able to articulate some of those reasons. But, one of the ways I like to think about it in the therapeutic context is that psychedelics seem to help the mind be a bit more flexible. And if you think of mental illness or mental health, problems on this spectrum of flexibility, a lot of what makes us sick is an inflexibility of thought and feeling. I think I am a piece of garbage and nothing can convince me otherwise. Even though I have people in my life who love me, even though, if I were to interview the people around this person, they would say, definitely not a piece of garbage. In fact, I really care about him and love him. That data can't update the belief. And, Robin Carhart-Harris talks about the neurophysiology of this, but psychedelics relax the mind in a certain way, make it more plastic and flexible, that then allow that data to actually update the core beliefs. And so people can change from that place, because I'm imagining like these cables. There's this wire in the brain and a wire in the heart, and they never connect. And psychedelics, clears the path, and they're allowed to connect. And I've heard clients say, for the first time, I actually felt the truth of the things I was trying to believe. I remember I had a client who was struggling with an eating disorder, and under the influence of ketamine, they experienced for the first time an appreciation for their body, right? Where, up until that point, they had hated their body and was trying to starve it and shape it so that it would be acceptable. So it can accelerate, it can grant access to things. It can create psychological flexibility where up until that point, it has been very difficult to do so. Now, I will sort of caution people. Some people will think of psychedelics as sort of this panacea or this miracle cure. You've heard it described as therapy in a bottle, or chemical mindfulness, or, 10 years of therapy in a day. And certainly some people have that experience. I think it's more the exception than the rule. Psychedelics still require thorough preparation. Sometimes they make things very, very difficult before they make things better. For some folks, they make things a lot worse. And expert facilitation and guidance and thorough integration are also really important in order to make the best out of a psychedelic therapy experience. So there's a lot of info there in that answer, but hopefully that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate the groundedness of kind of like explaining, that it is not that magic bullet. That's kind of my daily life when I get a new group of people coming in with all sorts of issues, and they want the solution right there, right now. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, hard to bring those bad news that, it's actually psychedelics is just that door to this long corridor of healing. And yes, it can like really open it really hard, really quickly. And there's a lot of progress that will come from that, but you still need to walk the walk and do all the work required. Something you mentioned is like psycho-spiritual health, which is the word that I've been hearing a lot recently. And it's, I think as a society now, we're kind of accepting psychedelics, but still mostly from a very psychological point of view. And me as somebody who is, I think I would like to say, balanced in my approach of not going, too woo-woo, but also still working with an indigenous shaman and seeing the work they do, but then also kind of grounding myself in more, reasonable like studies and psychological kind of understanding. So where do you see, what do you see there in this, physical body, spiritual body, mental body? What is your view of spiritual healing now as a psychiatrist, but also somebody who experienced those feelings themselves?
Yeah. I think psychology lost its soul a little bit along the way as it tried to become a legitimate science, quote unquote, legitimate science. And that isn't to say that the scientific method isn't super important and a really good method for trying to examine reality, right? And so I think it's still a really good thing for all, all the limitations acknowledged, for us to be trying to study psychedelic medicines, the phenomena that those medicines, evoke in a human psyche, so that we can just, try to figure out who these medicines might be good for. Are they safe? Are there ways to make them safer? Like, I think the science needs to continue. But if that is all we do, I think we are missing out on a lot of really important things. Because to be human is also to grapple with the unknowable, the grand mystery. And so when I say psychospiritual, that's kind of what I think and what I mean. Spiritual meaning, how do I create meaning and purpose in my life? Am I connected to something that feels bigger than me, whether that's community or God? And those of us that have used psychedelics, especially in a group setting like an ayahuasca ceremony, know that it can evoke this feeling of communitas, this connection with other people on a deep soul level, and not just the people in the room, but sometimes the people of your species, your ancestors, the human family. And so if we say that's all woo-woo, I think we're throwing out something that could be really, really important for our mental health, but also spiritual health. Also, when I think about where psychedelics came from, the people that have been using psychedelic medicines for hundreds, if not thousands of years, are not people who were testing them in a laboratory, right? In a modern Western laboratory. They were folks that were using them for a variety of reasons. And through tradition and experience, they developed what I would call psychospiritual technology. And that technology might be Icaros. That technology might be the combination of a plant and a vine, right? That technology might be what you do when somebody is purging or trying not to purge. It might be a drum. It might be certain settings in the wilderness. So, and I call those technologies because, maybe we didn't arrive at them through the laboratory type scientific method, but there's something true about those techniques. There's something important and informed and insightful about those strategies that if we just throw them out as, that's, what the people did in indigenous tribes and we have better access to information now, then we're really throwing out something very, very important. So I think the modern Western world, as it's, trying to push psychedelic medicines through, like, for instance, an FDA medical pipeline, we need to learn from those ancient technologies. And I think there's room, I hope there's room for all of us to do these things in our own ways so that we can increase access to healing states. But yeah, those are some of the things I think of. Because I think about I've, had the privilege to be in ayahuasca circles before, and I love how different they are than my ketamine therapy treatment in a sterile, basically hospital room that I had. And I think there's wonderful things to be gained from both contexts. And I would hate to throw one out.
Yeah, I think grounding ourselves in tradition can be really helpful, because it's kind of like if psychedelic experience is like a tree, the tradition is like the roots, which help holds it together. And I think, maybe like part of what happened in 60s where the mini psychedelic wave kind of went wrong is because they were trying to like rediscover it. And I think it's a mistake, like people in the West are doing, where it's like kind of like when the colonization was happening, is like we're discovering this new land and but there were people already living there, right? So it's kind of like accepting that there's an existing tradition, like instead of like rediscovering the bicycle, maybe getting something from it. And a lot of people I interviewed, there's a lot of good, there are some good bridges in between those two, traditional and therapeutical world. As just that whether people that fund those studies will actually allow that information exchange to happen, because obviously I understand there's a lot of interest in trying to patent the molecules and not working with existing stuff because for money motives, and that's kind of, we have to accept that that's the world we live in, and you got to kind of follow the rules. So it makes a lot of sense. I think as long as we do it slowly and responsibly, that's already better than the way it happened in 60s. Do you have any opinion of like the previous, let's say, psychedelic waves that happened?
Not strong opinions. I wouldn't describe myself as a psychedelic historian. I mean, I know what sort of the average person knows who's curious about this space. It does seem, just based on what I do know, that there was, there was a societal or maybe political backlash against what some people would say was a pretty cavalier use of psychedelics. Yes, there was, in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of good science being done, but then there was this sort of cultural movement, often hung on the shoulders of people like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, that spooked the normies, right? Spooked the muggles, if you want to use those terms. Like, these people don't want to participate in society. They want to turn on, there's a tune in, turn on and drop out or something like that. Or, if you want to get really cynical, they don't want to submit to governmental rule and go to war for us. We got to do something about this. So, the people that have been trying to carry that psychedelic torch through the darkness and then light it up here in this modern psychedelic renaissance are trying to do it a different way, it seems. Let's do it in tandem with government. Let's do it in tandem with industry so that we can not spook these folks and make sure that we grant access, like I was saying before, to these powerful medicines to people who really need it. And I understand that compromises have to be made and that sometimes you get bad actors who are trying to exploit a medicine simply for material gain, or like you alluded to, there's the destructive nature of colonization and appropriation. So it's messy, but I wasn't alive in the 60s, but it seems less messy now than it was back then for a variety of factors. So it makes me a little hopeful about this so-called modern renaissance. But we don't know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, we did just see Lykos get denied for the FDA approval for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, which shocked many of us, people who looked at that data and, the MAPS Lykos data and thought it was going to be a sure thing. So it's still going to be a tricky challenge, I think, to get these medicines in front of as many people as might need them.
When you talk about, societal change and how if we do it too quick or maybe too rushed, I mean, that's my opinion as somebody who kind of grew up I was born in USSR, so my first 3 years were in USSR. I don't remember much, but as I was growing up in now country of Latvia, which is part of European Union, so it kind of changed from one union to another. But it's pretty crazy to see what can happen when changes happen too quickly. Like they went from communism to capitalism. There was a lot of chaos. Nobody kind of understood what happens, and it resulted in a lot of turmoil. So somebody who lives now in this, you could say, community that has to do with psychedelics. Like what we're trying to do is get people to come over, drink ayahuasca, but still keep working. We have a co-working space. We have good internet most of the time, and we want people to use that psychedelic-inspired creativity to do stuff, to change the world, but gradually, because you wouldn't want to go from all of a sudden everyone drinking ayahuasca at the same time and like society collapsing, because we still all need there's this good example that just to make a pencil, you need like 300 different elements, and the society is really valuable. So I wish that we go through the change, but it has to be done gradually. So don't tune in and drop out immediately, do it gradually. So hopefully, maybe, I don't know, 100 years from now, we'll be able to find another way to live where maybe we hurt ecology less and we're more loving. Maybe there's less wars, but it got to be done slowly. Which kind of brings me to, you mentioned that you're a big fan of philosophy growing up. So, and philosophy, obviously, a lot of it comes from Greece. And they were also drinking psychedelics. Had an episode recently with the lady who she was coming live from Greece. she's Greek herself, and she's exploring those traditions. So what do you think about that? Where is there this interlap between philosophy and psychedelics? And you, as somewhat a philosopher yourself, what have you learned maybe from psychedelics?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I call myself much of a philosopher, but I do study a lot and think a lot about the human condition and what it means to be a person and how to make meaning out of life. I think, I've read some of the theories about the role that psychedelics have played in ancient traditions, including Grecian traditions, like the Eleusinian mysteries. It's fun for me to think that, there was this ritual that some of the greatest thinkers that the West has ever seen participated in, and that it helped them, come up with some of their ideas and their theories. And this idea that in order to find oneself, one has to lose oneself, I think plays well with those of us that have had psychedelic experiences, that to really know what it means to be human, that maybe we need to experience the loss of what that feels like, the so-called ego death, to die the little death so that we can return and live with greater hope, or something like that. I thought I understood me. I thought I understood how the mind worked. And then I altered my mind in a profound way with a psychedelic substance and realized that I didn't really know much before. Not that psychedelics have now made me enlightened, far from it. But I think if we're trying to investigate realities that our current tools, empirical or otherwise, can't touch very well, then it makes sense to use different tools. And I don't know exactly what's going on metaphysically or physically when we're taking psychedelics. We have a little bit of info on the physical side now with a lot of the cool neuroscience being done. But I can tell you what it feels like, and what a lot of my clients say it feels like. It feels like that, the brain is a receiver and the channel has been changed, and you get access to a different reality that feels more real than the one you live in day to day. So to say that it's just a drug experience, I think, is a little short-sighted and naive. And so from a philosophical perspective, when we're investigating the big questions, why are we here? Where are we going afterward, if anywhere? What does it mean to live a virtuous life? How should we relate to one another? Then psychedelics can, as the term implies, manifest what is in the mind in a way that is novel and interesting. So I have found psychedelics, of course, in a psychotherapeutic context to be incredibly helpful, but in an existential meaning-making, like we talked about before, spiritual, but even philosophical contexts, a powerful tool for investigating those perhaps ultimately unanswerable questions.
Yeah, as you say, powerful tool. It's kind of, I think Stan Grof said it, that psychedelics are for the mind what the telescope was for the astronomy, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like, yeah, of course, if you never had a telescope, you look at the star, you kind of know where your stars are, but then obviously with a telescope, you can see so much more. So it's kind of knowing that you don't know is already a good step to kind of getting into the bigger box. Interesting when you said, we're talking about the perspective changing, like changing the channel. I remember after one of the ayahuasca experiences where with my eyes open, I could see visions of like altered reality and flows of energy and stuff like that. So I had a thought, maybe an experiment, and you perform studies, so maybe it can be an idea for you. My question was, on a strong psychedelic experience, when you have when your psychedelic visions are intertwined with the reality, and it almost feels like you see what you normally are not able to perceive. It's kind of like enhanced vision. My question would be, if you were to have a strong psychedelic experience in a VR goggles, would the reality still be altered? And then if it wouldn't be, then it would be a good way to prove that what you're seeing actually exists. It's just you don't have the ability to see it. But I don't know if it makes any sense.
Yeah, that'd be a fun study to run. I think I'm not a neuroscientist, but from the little bit of neurophysiology that I know with respect to psychedelics, I think certain psychedelics, they create this phenomenon known as synesthesia, where this combination synthesis between senses. So people will see sounds and they'll hear colors. And there's interesting activation in the regions of the brain involved with sight. And then in combination with the synesthetic effect and the neuroplasticity that it causes, that maybe is a neurological explanation for why people see visions. And I imagine that if that's the case, it would still be present with VR goggles on. But I also, just when I'm having fun thinking about this, I like to think, there are light spectrums that the human eye can't pick up on, but it doesn't mean that they aren't there, like ultraviolet light, for example. Or our hearts and other organ systems give off an electromagnetic field that we aren't necessarily conscious of, but we feel certain ways in the presence of other people. And it might be a subtle, micro expressions and things like that, but it might be their scent. It might be the electromagnetic field that they're giving off. And there are people that seem to have extrasensory perception and an intuition that is unexplainable. And maybe this is all explained by cognitive biases and limitations of our minds to grasp reality. But again, as a person who's a PhD social scientist, I have a love and a fidelity to the scientific method, but also I'm leaving a ton of room for the unexplainable, right? There's still so much about reality that we don't understand. And maybe psychedelics as a channel changer give us access to certain, I don't know, I was about to say quantum field. I don't want to piss off the physicists, but like certain realities that our normal thinking don't have access to. So that's about as woo as I get, Sam. Just me sort of having reverence for the mystery.
Well, woo or not, and you mentioned the word quantum. even in the physics itself, the deeper we go into the physics, the more it starts to sound like woo. There's the electron is here, but it's also here. Like, what do you mean? And all those newer kind of experiments that they're doing. It's kind of like we're almost going full circle where science is connecting with spirituality again. And then especially it has to happen in the psychological field because, what is our conscious? Where is it coming from? Quantum computers and all that stuff. So I have no answers for that. I have just curiosity, and hopefully one day somebody will come on this podcast and explain to me, exactly what happens. And you mentioned synesthesia. It's a really real thing. One of my first ayahuasca experiences, I could see music. It almost looked like, those old Windows media players. I don't know if you're a Mac guy, but like equalizer dancing. Like I could see that with my eyes closed together with the music. But interestingly enough, I could also see where the shaman was anytime in the ceremonies, like this blob of light with my eyes closed. And I don't know, maybe it's my mind, maybe whatever, but anytime I would open my eyes to check, it was pretty accurate. So that's another thing we could maybe run a study on. Let's speaking about like podcasts and guests. I know you also have a podcast yourself. So why did you start a podcast?
Yeah, we've been doing Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers for around 3 years now, almost 170 episodes. We started it, my co-host and I, Dr. Reed Robison, started it because we both have a passion for education, for free access to good information. And we recognized that there were a few really good podcasts in the psychedelic space at the time when we started. We just wanted to add our voice and have an excuse to talk to cool people in this industry and to do a deep dive on topics that were interesting to us, and then potentially share that with people who might find it interesting. I myself have benefited a lot from podcasts, been listening to podcasts for many, many years. They have been a source of continuing education and exploration and connection with other people interested in similar things for me. And so I kind of wanted to pay that forward. Also, as a therapist, I help one person at a time, generally, unless I'm facilitating a group where I get to go really deep. And I really love that. I love depth. I love vulnerability. I love the safety that can be created with vulnerability and the growth that comes out of that. But I also wanted to sort of, I guess, cast the net a little bit wider and help as many people as I could from an educational perspective. Both my parents were educators, and so I love to teach and I love to share. So those were some of the primary motivations for starting a podcast. It was also just kind of an experiment. Reed and I both, like I said, have really enjoyed podcasts and had thought for many years about starting one, just didn't know what to talk about. And here I was having developing my, pivoting my career towards psychedelics and teaching other therapists at the time about ketamine-assisted therapy. And I wanted an excuse to develop even further. And as many people who are listening know, that to teach something is to learn it on a different level. So those are some of our primary motives. And we've gotten to talk to some really cool, really interesting people. The majority of our episodes are just me and Reed having a conversation about a mental health topic, typically psychedelic related, but not always. But yeah, we've had the honor to interview some really fun folks.
Yeah, podcasts is a great way to meet cool people. Like, I would probably not otherwise be talking to you right now. And I've checked your podcast out as well. I really liked your episode on ayahuasca. I think it was really informed one with a lot of facts and like scientific knowledge. So it's a really good one for those who are listening. Definitely go check it out. Psychedelic Frontiers podcast, right?
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, yeah.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. Check out the episode on the ayahuasca. Speaking of your podcast, like out of the guests that you had, I know you it's a lot of just you talking to Reed, but also what's the most I don't know, like memorable guest you had?
We've had a lot of memorable ones. The interview with Chris Beisch, the author of LSD and the Mind of the Universe, was really, really cool. I mean, I read his book and it struck me on a deep level. Here was this, professor, philosopher who over the course of decades did 70 plus high dose LSD journeys facilitated by his wife in a very systematic way. And it was like he was taking a core sample of the universe. This guy just had the most amazing insights and suffering. Like he just went through these really difficult experiences to glean these insights. And so that one was really fascinating. The one with Richard Schwartz, the pioneer behind internal family systems therapy, or IFS, was a delight. Reed and I both enjoy that particular therapeutic modality, internal family systems, and find that it pairs well with psychedelics. We got to interview Rick Doblin. It was before the FDA ruling, and Rick's an inspiring character, a maverick, just tireless in his efforts to bring psychedelics, MDMA in particular, to the masses. We got to interview Gul Dolan, who's a researcher that's done some of the more fascinating research on psychedelics and neuroplasticity. And from her, we get this idea around critical windows, that where psychedelics sort of reopen these learning windows neurologically that tend to close as we develop, and that might be potentially one of the explanations for why they can help people change where other things haven't been able to. Yeah, those are the ones that float to the top of my mind. We've been able to talk to so many cool people. What's that guy? DMT, the spirit molecule. That's funny that I'm forgetting his name. He was on Joe Rogan and stuff. I
don't have an assistant like Joe Rogan does. It's like, bring Jimmy. Yeah. I just found, I was just Googling it as well. Rick Strassman. You got lots of cool guests. That's once again the benefit of running a podcast. And you yourself, obviously, as you interview people, you learn a lot, and in your work you also learn a lot. And I know you talk a lot about the importance of the self-growth for facilitators, for the therapists themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that with us?
Yeah. If you choose to hold space for other people when they're altering their consciousness in this very vulnerable way, then you have a certain ethical responsibility to be able to hold that space in a safe and integrous way. So, in order to do that, I think one needs thorough training. but one also needs to make sure that they're taking good care of themselves, because, you are part of the setting. We talk a lot in psychedelic therapy about set and setting, or the mindset and the setting in which you're doing the psychedelic medicine. And as a space holder or a facilitator or a guide or a therapist, you are a very important part of that setting. So if you're bringing, as one of my supervisors would say, your shit into the room, then that potentially can harm other people, or at least interfere with their process. So this isn't to say you need to be a perfected, enlightened being in order to do this work, but you should be relatively self-aware, so that when something gets triggered in you, you can discern, is this my stuff? And do I just need to manage this so I can be here for this person? Or is this being elicited from me, and it might be good data that I can help this person with? Is it more about the things they elicit because of the way they move through the world, and less about my particular, demons, so to speak? In the therapy world, we call that this dance between transference and countertransference. So is the client transferring onto us a dynamic that is alive in their life, maybe from their childhood, and that we can work with, and is a good opportunity to create change? Or is it countertransference, meaning that we are transferring something onto them from our lives, and if unacknowledged, that can be really damaging. So those are some reasons why it's important to do self-development work. I think also, when we teach, when I've taught psychedelic-assisted therapy to others, inevitably the question comes up: should guides, therapists, facilitators have experience with the medicine that they're working with? The general consensus from the people that I've talked to is it makes sense, right? Although, and this might be a controversial take, I don't think for some medicines it's absolutely necessary in order to hold safe space, at the very least, that you have that experience. I think it's tremendously helpful. I like to think of it in terms of like a wilderness survival guide. If I'm going into the wilderness with a survival guide, I would like to know that survival guide has been in that wilderness, but if they haven't, I want to at least know they've been in a wilderness and they've had a chance to practice their wilderness survival skills to the level that they are an expert. I recently read this book called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life by Boyd Vardy. And in there he talks about, learning how to track in Africa, how to track lions, and his teacher saying when they lost the lion's track, he's asking him, well, what do we do? We've lost the track. And his teacher says something like, well, I don't know where we're going, but I know exactly how to get there. And I think that's a great metaphor for facilitating or helping other people through psychedelic experience. Because just because you've had a particular experience doesn't mean they're going to have that same experience. I think young facilitators or inexperienced facilitators are in danger of making that assumption. Like, oh, I've done ayahuasca. I know what you're experiencing. The hell you do. Like you might know what it's like to, be in distress or to, communicate with entities, et cetera, but you don't know what it's like for them. So you don't know where they're going. But if you have good facilitation skills, good therapy skills, you might know how to get there, meaning I'm going to provide safety and support. I'm going to, depending on the kind of therapy you're doing, I'm going to direct them inward. I'm going to remind them to breathe, those kinds of things. So important to do your own work, and important to get good training too.
Yeah, that's very true. As somebody who, I kind of stopped counting, but probably around 100 ceremonies of ayahuasca, and never having same experience twice, I can truly attest to the fact that the moment you feel like it is the moment that you're probably going to have a very difficult experience, and it will be shown to you that you only know that you don't know. But on the opposite spectrum of this, what would you tell someone who's they did all the necessary training and they're trying to work in the psychedelic field, but it is a new field. So even there is not this legacy 200-year university program you can attend, and a lot of people have to choose whether they ground themselves in a indigenous tradition or in more traditional psychology training. And let's say somebody's working in that field and they might be feeling imposter syndrome. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, imposter syndrome or imposter feelings, they can be good data, meaning that maybe we don't want to totally dismiss those feelings as they come up, because they might be indicative of, I don't feel as confident as I would like to feel. Maybe I need more training. Maybe I need more experience. But certainly we've known people, or maybe experienced ourselves, in situations where we do have a lot of experience and we do have a lot of training, yet we still feel like an imposter. So at some point, moving forward with that fear on board is indicated, right? It's not that the first time after getting thoroughly trained, I facilitated like a ketamine-assisted therapy experience, I was 100% confident. But I was confident enough and had the support of my community of practice and my teachers and my supervisors that I felt okay about moving forward, even though I was feeling a little afraid and not 100% confident. So, yes, sometimes imposter syndrome is good data, and it implies that we need to get more training and support. And then sometimes it's one of those stories, right? One of those stories coming from a part of our psyche that doesn't want us to fail, and that would never be satisfied no matter how much preparation we do, or is afraid of being judged, et cetera, et cetera. But I think having a community of practice is really important. Getting support, accountability, supervision, education. And because, as you know, a lot of people who do this work, they're doing it in the so-called underground because it's not legal, some of these medicines. And that can be a really isolating place because they feel they have to be clandestine so they don't get in trouble. They got to remain private, and then it's hard to get the kind of support that I get to enjoy working in a clinic, working with colleagues, doing the podcast, interacting with folks like you, doing ketamine-assisted therapy. So community of practice is important too.
Yeah, I would choose a facilitator with imposter syndrome over anyone, over I had ayahuasca once, and now I'm a shaman kind of person any day. So there's like those two extremes, and it's kind of would be nice to find the balance. But I can imagine as a head of training in Numinous, you interact with a lot of people that are on the path to become facilitators. And so how does it make you feel that potentially, you're being a part of creating this population of people that will then interact with more people, kind of creating that chain effect? And also, like, what would your message be to somebody who, let's say somebody who is has a psychology background and they want to switch to doing more psychedelics in their practice?
Yeah. So, I'm very humbled by the idea that I would have an influence in somebody that's trying to learn these skills. It's humbling also in the sense that I take it really seriously, right? It's a responsibility. If people listen to my podcast and they think of me as some kind of authority, A, that intimidates the hell out of me because I have my own version of imposter syndrome. And B, it inspires me, right? It inspires me to make sure that the information I'm giving is well thought out, well researched, in context. So it's an honor to be able to teach other people, and it's also why I do it. I really hope that in my own limited way, I can help people pay attention to the things that are important, and in their efforts to work with psychedelics in whatever capacity they work with them, the things that I've noticed are important. The things that I've learned are important from people with more experience than me. Inevitably, I'll make mistakes. I'm trying to make compassionate space for those mistakes. But for people who are interested and they want to get involved, there are a couple places I like to point people. Certainly, the training program that we do at Numinous, I'm a little bit biased toward because I'm the lead instructor for Numinous, but we have an entire education pathway where people can take a variety of courses, all designed to help them feel prepared to work with psychedelic medicine. And then there are other communities like Psychedelic Grad is one I like to point people to. It's an online community, and if you just Google Psychedelic Grad, you'll find it for people who are students or people who are interested in getting involved professionally in psychedelics. A lot of great resources in a community there where you can, share notes and interact. There are some, I'm not, off the top of my head, I couldn't list them, but there are some programs now that are, where you can get training in psychotherapy, and there's also a psychedelic component. I think those types of organizations are going to be, or training programs are going to be more available as the research progresses. Certainly, if MDMA or psilocybin gets FDA approved as a medicine, we're going to need a lot of good, well-trained professionals. So I think programs will pop up. But go out there and get training and don't be alone, right? You got podcasts like yours. There are a lot of really great training programs, like the one at Psychedelics Today. The Vital program is really good. Third Wave, Paul Austin's organization, has a lot of good education, training, and community. Just a lot of great education and training out there. So let your curiosity lead you and be insatiable. Get as much information as you can.
Very good recommendations. Steve, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast. I think it's time for us to wrap up. So anything else you might want to tell to the audience, and then where can they find you, or where can they learn more about you?
Yeah, Sam, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me on. If people want to learn more about me, they can go to my website, Dr. Steve Thayer, Thayer, drstevethayer.com. For better or worse, I'm on Instagram. I don't post a whole lot these days, but you can find me on Instagram. I tend to put clips from the podcast on there. Of course, please listen to the podcast if you're interested in mental health generally and psychedelic-assisted therapy specifically. That's Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. And then, if you're interested in our clinical trial research or in our training, you can go to numinous.com/training for training, or /research for our clinical trial work.
Thank you, Steve. Definitely, guys, check out Steve and the podcast. It's a lot of fun. It's a really good podcast. There's not many good psychedelic related podcasts, and yours is definitely one of them. And you've been listening to Ayahuasca Podcast. As always, with your host, Sam Believ, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to support us and psychedelic renaissance at large, please follow us and leave us a like wherever it is you're listening. Share this episode with someone who will benefit from this information. Nothing in this podcast is intended as medical advice, and it is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This episode is sponsored by La Huayra Ayahuasca Retreat. At La Huayra, we combine affordability, accessibility, and authenticity. La Huayra, connect, heal, grow. Guys, I'm looking forward to hosting you.
Con la vida te la baila, cura con la guaira, limpia, taita, vibrando.